Now, we all think. You're thinking right now. You're interpreting the things I say. You're listening, hopefully. You're thinking right now. Everything you do, deciding what to eat today, deciding whether to go to school, all of those are decisions that you make, and it includes the process of thinking. But not all of us think critically. One way to think about critical thinking is that it is the point at which you become aware of your thinking. When you begin to think about your thinking. Thinking about your thinking is part of critical thinking. Now, I need to correct two things in case you have the wrong impression about critical thinking. Number one is that in the news right now, just as much as we've heard about things like kneeling and all sorts of national protests, one thing that has been really popular in the news lately is something called critical theory, and a kind of critical theory called critical race theory. Critical thinking is completely different from critical theory, critical race theory. I've had the impression sometimes that people think if they are an advocate or a believer in things like critical theory and critical race theory, then that just means they're thinking critically about race. Those are two separate issues. And as a matter of fact, the people who developed critical theory back in the 1930s would actually not appreciate the kind of critical thinking that I'm discussing today. Critical theory is a certain theory about how to interpret social science like sociology and psychology and anthropology and even philosophy. Critical race theory initially started out as a legal theory and has influenced a lot of other disciplines like education and philosophy. But that is a completely separate subject. The other thing I want to correct is that being critical is not always being negative. Being critical doesn't mean the same thing as being negative. So we associate in our language words like criticism and critique and critical, sometimes with negative concepts. We also do this with concepts like argumentation. One thing about critical thinking is you're going to learn how to argue well. And many people have an aversion to that. They're like, I don't want to argue. I don't want to learn how to argue better, because they think arguments are heated emotional debates where people get mad and yell at each other. That is one definition of the word argument. Go look it up in a dictionary. You will see one definition of it might be something like heated emotional debate. And then you'll see several other definitions. That's not the kind of argumentation we're talking about today. And we're not talking about the negative versions of criticism, critique, and critical either. To be a critical thinker is more like being a careful thinker, being a fine-tuned thinker, being an analytical thinker. It's when you're paying attention to the details. In other words, you have an awareness of the critical questions, plus the ability, desire, and willingness to ask them at the right times. It doesn't mean that you're always being negative and talking smack about people. When I was teaching over on the Darrington unit several years ago, I would have the students write a critique of a certain book I wanted them to read. And I had to tell them, I want you to critique this book, but I don't want you to talk smack about the author and talk about how horrible the book was and how horrible of an author he is. That's not what doing a critique is about. It might include something negative, but what it really means is just evaluating, analyzing, picking out what is the actual argument, what is being said right now. So, very heated political, religious, ethical issues like the national anthem controversy are areas where critical thinking is desperately needed. Racial issues in the news are areas where critical thinking is desperately needed. Critical thinking is one of those skills that you can learn, which is going to help you no matter what subject you take, no matter what trade you get involved in, no matter what job you go into. Because just imagine, it doesn't matter if you're a welder, a truck driver, a lawyer, a chemist, a psychologist, or an accountant. If you're able to be clear about the issues, if you're able to be clear about appropriate evidence, you're going to be better at all of them. In the career and technical industries, when you're troubleshooting something, you're thinking critically about the issue and trying to diagnose it. Call it troubleshooting if that helps, whatever. We're doing the same thing. We're identifying the issues, trying to figure out what evidence is needed in order to prove or disprove something, diagnosing. All of that language is appropriate. So, critical thinking is an awareness of a certain set of interrelated critical questions and the ability, desire, and willingness to ask and answer them at the appropriate times. Critical thinking is like when you start to think about your thinking. It doesn't mean the same thing as this stuff you hear in the news about critical theory and critical race theory. Those are two separate issues. And it also doesn't mean that you're always negative all the time, that you're always pointing out flaws in things. Critical thinking is more like careful, evaluative, analytical thinking.